Hello, my name is Kirby Watts. I am 14 years old. I am in the 8th grade and I go to a school called Our Lady of Mercy Catholic School in Daly City. Tio Ted has been in a prisoner of war camp called Santo Tomas Prisoner of War Camp. Tio Ted, can you tell us about your experience in that prisoner of war camp when you were a child?
Thank you, Kirby. You did a fine job on Cadwallader. He hasn't slept in 3 nights trying to pronounce that name. My name is Ted Cadwallader. You're wondering what a character by the name of Cadwallader was doing in the Philippines. Well, let me give you a little Cadwallader history in the Philippines, if I may. Oh, by the way, Cecilia and Connie have given me 2.5 hours to make this presentation. I thought it'd scare you. We're pretty close to Halloween. Brooke Cadwallader, my great uncle, went to the Philippines in 1898 with the American Army. As you know, that was the Spanish-American War. After the war, I think, these are anecdotal comments, by the way, he called for his brother, my grandfather, Frederick Charles Cadwallader, to come over from Texas. The family lived in the Dallas-Fort Worth area at that time. So Frederick Charles went to the Philippines. He eventually, within a few years, married my grandmother, Florence Dolland, who was a mestiza. They had 4 children. My father was the first of 4 children, William F. Cadwallader, Bill. The Cadwallader business in Manila was quite lucrative in those days, as was a lot of American business operations in the Philippines. My grandfather was in charge, or did found, the Cadwallader Lumber Company, which harvested lumber on the Bataan Peninsula. And I think some of the battles on Bataan in 1942 were fought on the territory that my grandfather mined for, if you want to call it that, lumber. He had a large lumber mill in Limay on Bataan, and he had another lumber mill on the Pasig River in Manila. Things went along pretty well until about the 1920s. The lumber business pretty much folded in 1927 on Bataan due to malarial mosquitoes wiping out people and or fires. My grandfather died in 1930 here in San Francisco. I never knew my grandfather. My mother and father, by the way, both my mother and father were born in Manila. My mother was an Australian. She was born to Australian parents from Melbourne. She was born in 1911. My dad was born in 1906 in Manila. They were married in 1932 in the Archbishop's Palace in Manila. A lot of people were present, and in those days you had big parties too. One of my aunts, by the way, married Don Manolo Elizalde, so we have some marriage connection with the Elizalde family in the Philippines. In 1932, as I said, my folks got married. In 1938, along came Ted Cadwallader, all right? I was born in the Spanish hospital in Makati. When I was 3 years and 3 months old, the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor. When I was 3 years and 4 months old, my mother tells me we were some of the first Americans into the University of Santo Tomas concentration camp early in January 1942. Japanese Imperial Army occupied the city of Manila on the 2nd of January 1942 and immediately started rounding up enemy aliens. That's what we were, as a matter of fact. One statistic I always make in these little presentations is the Japanese captured and interned 14,000 American civilians, men, women, and children, in the Pacific and China theaters of World War II. I think everyone in this room has heard of the Japanese-American internments here in the United States, particularly on the West Coast, about 120,000. 14,000 of us, you're looking at one of those 14,000, were interned in various prison camps by the Japanese, again, in the Pacific and China theaters. Some of us died. Some of us were murdered, all of us suffered. I've been asked to give some remembrance of the Santo Tomas internment camp. Of course, I was just a little over 3 years old. I don't remember the first part of the operation. I do remember some of the internment as we entered into probably towards the end of the second and the third year we were in there. By the way, we were in there for 37 months. Another aside, too, my mother told me that some of the Americans, when they went into the camp, said, we're all going to be here for 2 or 3 weeks, all right? Because the American army is going to come back and liberate us. Well, 37 months later, they did come back. Thank you. I do remember the shanties. We had a lot of shanties. The Japanese permitted us to get material in from the outside to build shanties. Some of our Filipino employees, we called them servants in those days. You can't call them that now because it's not PC. They were very loyal to those of us in the camp. And I always say, God bless the Filipinos, because we wouldn't have survived if it wasn't for the Filipinos that we knew and the Filipinos that assisted us. They brought us food, they brought us mattresses, they brought us medicines and whatever they could get a hold of and ship through the front gate of the camp under Japanese eyes. We survived. That ended, as you heard earlier today, probably in the end of the second year. All right. I've got several remembrances here, and I won't go into all of them, but anyway, one of them was towards the end of the war, we had a lot of American air raids. I was swinging on the swing in the Santo Tomas camp when a Japanese sentry yelled at me from about 50 yards behind me and told me to get the heck out of there and get under cover. He had a long Arisaka Japanese rifle with a long Type 29 bayonet. These things were mean-looking weapons and very tall. They were taller than the Japanese soldiers, as a matter of fact. These were pre-World War I technologies. Another thing I remember is the Japanese ACAC, air artillery, AAA. This is towards the end of 1944. As a 6-year-old boy, I would look up into the sky every now and then, and here was Japanese ACAC going on. One day, they were shooting up colored ACAC, and I think they were range finding. They were blue, white-colored, reds, and all kinds of different colors. It was exciting to me as a 6-year-old. It was just like the 4th of July. Amazing, absolutely amazing. I remember those of us who were kids in the camp, by the way, there were approximately 700 kids in this camp. I remember running around with some of my cohorts and gathering up the leaflets that were dropped from American planes towards the end of the internment. We had a ball, let me tell you, really enjoyed that, grabbing these as they came down from, I don't know, 15,000 feet, whatever. In January 1945, a B-24 was hit over Manila. These were heavy bombers, probably out of Mindoro. It was hit and it was burned, and the crew bailed out. As I understand it, I wasn't there at the time. I mean, I was there, but I didn't see it. These American airmen were shot before they reached the ground. At that particular time, I was in a makeshift bomb shelter that my parents had built for me in the shanty. It was built with 2 or 3 boards sitting on a couple of suitcases, and on top of the boards were 3 or 4 more suitcases, the suitcases that we came into camp with about 3 years earlier. I was hiding under there on orders of my parents, and my mother came into the shanty crying, and I was wondering what she was crying about, and she said they shot down an American plane. I remember smoke coming into the camp from that shoot down and some debris falling into the camp. During the internment, this was early in the internment, my mother was permitted to take me out of the camp to visit her Australian parents, my Australian grandparents. They were very elderly. They weren't in the camp. They were enemy aliens, but they were so elderly and decrepit, as it were, they were permitted to stay outside. The only remembrance I have of my Australian parents is walking into their house, into their patio area, whatever, and on the second level, my Australian grandfather, William John Williams, said, hey, my grandmother's name was, I can't remember now. He said, hey, Billy and Ted are here. Those are the only words I remember coming from my Australian grandparents. My grandmother on the Australian side died on December the 7th, 1944, 3 years after Pearl Harbor. My Australian grandfather, who was senile at the time, was burned up in one of the houses in the Battle of Manila. I don't think his body was ever found. My mother found out about it from a nurse later, or probably a nurse. Another remembrance in Santo Tomas was my first communion. This was towards the end of the internment also. We had our first communion in the basement animal museum in the main building in the University of Santo Tomas. They had all these animals in glass cages, stuffed, of course, and we had candles. It was a dark morning. It was very early in the morning, and we had a few candles around. And I thought this was kind of, I still remember that morning because not only was I hungry, but it was a little bit surreal to have a first communion with candles and animals looking at you. Oh yeah, I had a first communion breakfast after that. My mother had saved for years now a quarter of an inch, maybe half an inch of Quaker oats in a Quaker oats bag, box, whatever. So I had that for breakfast. I still remember that I devoured that Quaker oats because I was pretty hungry. We were all pretty hungry at that point. I still remember the Quaker oats on my first communion breakfast. Thank you. Liberty. Of course, I remember Liberation Night, February the 3rd, 1945. Most of you know that General Douglas MacArthur was anxious, very anxious to get to the city of Manila. He loved the Filipinos, he loved the Philippines, and he loved his home in the Manila Hotel, in the penthouse. So he brought his army up from Leyte after a major battle in Leyte, as you well know. They landed in Lingayen, on Luzon, on the 9th of January, 1945. The army was under the command of Lieutenant General Walter Kruger, who wasn't moving fast enough for MacArthur. Kruger had made some advances, and he got pretty close to Cabanatuan. And so someone decided to make a raid on Cabanatuan on January the 30th, 1945, a very successful raid. 513 American military POWs were liberated that particular day due to the efforts of the 6th Army Rangers, the Alamo Scouts, and certainly the Filipino guerrillas. The Filipino guerrillas held off thousands of Japanese armed, experienced troops so that these 125 6th Army Rangers and these Alamo Scouts could get into Cabanatuan and liberate these 513 American POWs. And again, I must emphasize, they could not have done it without the Filipinos holding off major numbers of Japanese troops.